So here we are with Gods and Monsters. Where have we been? Just very quickly. First lecture was How to Make a God, Religion and Anthropomorphism. We looked at how we might make gods in our image instead of us being made in gods. We looked at how to make a monster, the monster as the id, Freud's id, but also monster culture. What happens, in what space do monsters operate? We saw how the monster always returns. The monster is a symbol of difference, etc., of otherness. We looked at giving birth to gods and monsters in Hesiod's Theogony and Enuma Elish, and saw that gods and monsters were the same. They were really just the same. And we are all gods and monsters as well. The divine and monstrous feminine was an interesting discussion with some goddesses from the ancient world, and then the story of Medusa. Christian gods and monsters, where we looked at the book of Revelation, which was fun. Then we looked at Leviathans, Thomas Hobbes' notion, kind of moving chronologically here. We looked at Thomas Hobbes' notion of his theory of the state, which he decided to name a monster, Leviathan, for reasons that we saw. And then last week was the death of God and the rise of the Superman, Friedrich Nietzsche, and thus spoke Zarathustra. Awesome. All right. So this week is Frankenstein. In many ways, Frankenstein is really the genesis of this whole course, right? Because Frankenstein's our favorite monster. He's the one we know best. He's the more recent one. He's the one who's been put into more stories than any monster, I think, ever. That's probably fair to say, right? Whether it's literature or film. And in fact, the title of the course is stolen, like all my best stuff, from Bride of Frankenstein, James Whale's book, film, where he says at one point, to a whole new world of gods and monsters. And then there was the great film with Ian McKellen many years ago. So it's appropriate that here at week 8 we are talking about Frankenstein, our favorite monster. Now, most people haven't read Frankenstein. Most people don't need to read Frankenstein because it's in the culture, right? It's in the air. And that's okay. I'm going to lay it out for you. So Frankenstein begins, the novel begins at the North Pole. What? Yes, at the North Pole, with a man named Robert Walton, who is an explorer. Robert Walton is an uninteresting man, despite being an explorer. He doesn't seem to have a wife. In fact, the novel is, in part, his letters to his sister back in Seville, England. So, okay. And metaphorically and actually, Robert Walton is stuck in the ice at the Arctic Pole. Can't move. He's stuck. And what happens is a man comes aboard his ship from the ice, which is, completely unexpected, of course. What's a man doing up there on the ice? This man is Victor Frankenstein, and he begins to tell Mr. Walton a story. And the story is that he has, the story is the novel, the bulk of the novel. He describes a blissful childhood, Victor Frankenstein does, in the company of his cousin Elizabeth. It's his cousin in the 1818 edition. In the 1831 edition, it becomes his adopted sister. So there's no blood relation. You might be able to see where this is going. He enters the University of Ingolstadt to study natural philosophy. Now, natural philosophy then was science, right? So my friends who have degrees in biology and chemistry and physics, they have Ph.Ds. They have doctors of philosophy, just as I do. That's because philosophy is the ultimate degree. It's the ultimate indication of knowing. It's the ultimate emblem of knowing. And it doesn't matter what kind of knowing it is, right? It's all the knowing, possibly all the knowing. Early on in the Middle Ages, when the universities were founded, it was in fact all knowing. Every discipline there was. As knowledge increased, specialization had to occur. So Victor's interested in natural philosophy, and that means chemistry. There he's kind of overcome by the desire to discover the secret of life. And so his studies take him there. And he has these two professors we're going to talk about. One's very, very scientific in that he's very about the method and the empirical world, and another's more alchemistic. He's more about, well, these natural things, they kind of lead us to some unnatural things and some maybe symbolic things. So alchemy. One night, in the secrecy of his apartment, and after Victor has been gathering body parts from graves in the area, he puts together his creature. He brings it to life. The creature stirs, wakes up, and reaches out to him. This is his moment. This is the creation of life. Victor is a god. There is his monster. What does Victor do? He flees. He flees. Why does he flee? Well, because he's overcome at what he's done. He's created life out of death. And also, the monster's horrific. He's stitched together of many parts. Remember, when we talked about the nature of monsters, we discussed how monsters are other, and so they are often hybrids. Remember some of the drawings we saw in the earlier lectures? Monsters are made, they have their arms in the wrong place, or they have only one, they're not symmetrical. This is what a monster is. But Victor created him that way, but he's horrified at his creation, and so he flees. Well, the monster doesn't know what to do, so he flees. But the monster is a newborn, right? The monster is actually 8 feet tall, but he's a newborn. So he has to learn the world. He has to learn who he is and who everyone else is. And it's kind of hard to do when you're 8 feet tall and made of several body parts stitched together loosely. So Victor returns to Geneva, his home. And before he gets there, he learns that his younger brother, William, has died, been murdered, in fact. A servant girl named Justine is accused and convicted of the murder, but it's clear she did not do it. She's a servant girl, so she's the easiest target, and she is executed. But Victor knows better. He thinks it was his creature. Now he is sick, at heart even worse, in despair. His brother is dead, an innocent girl is dead. Victor then flees to the mountains. Now, this is a romantic novel, among other things. You don't look to God for comfort, you look to nature or the sublime. And so Victor's on a mountaintop, in the Alps, in fact, and there he meets his creature. The creature confronts him, and this is kind of the climax of the novel as well in many ways, because they're on the mountain, they're alone. Here they are in the sublime, among the sublime, which is the sacred for romantics. All right, very good. The monster has this interrogation of Victor about, why did you leave me? I was alone. I'm new in the world, and you left me, you abandoned me. And Victor's like, you're horrible, you're a monster, I couldn't bear to look at you. And the monster says, fine, that's why I killed your brother. And he says, "I'll tell you what, I have to have a companion. You must make a female companion for me, or I will kill your fiancée, Elizabeth," who in 1831 is not related, but in 1818 is. Victor reluctantly says yes and goes to Scotland to make this other monster. It's not clear why he goes to Scotland, but I would go to Scotland if I were making a monster. He starts to put together a female creature for his first creature. He doesn't know that his first creature is watching through the window. So he's trying to do it in the dead of night. I guess maybe in Scotland he wanted to be away from everyone, although he did the first one in Ingolstadt. Anyway, he cannot bring himself to bring this woman to life, and so he rips her apart on the table to put her in sacks. And he takes her out into the ocean and dumps her. Well, the monster, the creature, sees this and is livid and kills his friend who's come with him to Scotland and tells Victor that he will see him on his wedding night. So Victor and Elizabeth are engaged. The monster knows all this. He's been watching them. And he says, "I'll see you on your wedding night." So Victor thinks that the monster, the creature, I hesitate to call him a monster. We'll talk about why. The creature is going to kill him. So he has his wedding. He sits up all night with a gun. But no, it's not Victor the monster is after. It is his bride. And he kills Elizabeth. Now Victor's enraged. He tracks the monster who leads him into the Arctic. And the monster leaves him clues, leaves him food. This is a fascinating chase story, if nothing else. So that Victor keeps pursuing. And then that's where we end up with Robert Walton. It circles back. In fact, you'll see it's several circles. And to Victor telling his story to the sea captain. Victor dies on the ship, and the monster wanders off because the monster always returns. Remember, the monster might die, but the monster comes back. All right, so that's the overview. That may be surprising. It is surprising to most people, given that we know Frankenstein through film mainly, and film has taken a lot of license with this story. None better than Mel Brooks, of course, with Young Frankenstein. The best story of Frankenstein, if you're going to do a comedy, just get Gene Wilder and Mel Brooks. So here's what I want to do. This is a difficult story to talk about. And I think that's by design, but we'll talk about why. So here's the approach I want to take here. I want to talk about the creators and the creatures. Two creators, two creatures, all right? Mary Shelley and Victor Frankenstein are the creators. The creatures are the novel and the monster, all right? To a whole new world of gods and monsters. Mary Shelley is an interesting story in her own right. She was the daughter of William Godwin. When we talked about political theory and Leviathan a few weeks ago, we could have talked about William Godwin, who is the author of An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, basically the first anarchist argument. He argued that if we use our reason and wisdom, we don't need a state. We'll self-regulate. We'll overcome that state of nature we talked about with our reason. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was the first feminist. She wrote, if you've ever taken a women's literature class, you know Mary Wollstonecraft. She wrote Vindication of the Rights of a Woman. So this is late 18th century, early 19th century. These are radical people. I mean, radical in thought and in practice. William did not want to educate Mary. He thought she was smart enough on her own, and she would find her own way, and he was right in his own way. Mary knew her mother only through her mother's writings, because her mother died in giving birth to Mary. She died 11 days after her birth. Now, let's think about all this. I am not one to psychoanalyze an author. I think it's a little too easy most of the time, but there's something going on here. Her mother died 11 days after giving birth. She knows her mother only through her mother's works, which are significant. Vindication of the rights of woman in whatever it was, 1797, or I guess. She was the product of amazing parents. She would sit upon her mother's grave and write. She wanted to be a writer, so she would sit there on her grave. And her lover, Percy Bysshe Shelley, seduced her there on her mother's grave. So we're already in some dark places, people, right? Their first child dies after 6 days. Percy Shelley was married, by the way, this whole time, to Harriet, who later commits suicide. It is a dark and stormy time. It is said, Mary, in talking about writing the novel, says that on March 19th, 1815, right before she was to begin the novel, and I'll tell you that story too, puts in her journal this line: "I had a dream that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold and that we rubbed it before the fire and it lived." We rubbed it before the fire and it lived. Again, I'm not saying that we can psychoanalyze Mary, but wow. You rubbed it before the fire and it lived. That's exactly what Victor does, right? Using electricity. So, that's the creator, Mary Shelley. What is her monster? What is her novel? Let's talk about this novel. Do you know this story? The birth of this novel? It's a very interesting story in its own right. Mary and Percy were in a cottage on Lake Geneva, June of 1816, with some friends who included, Mary was accompanied by her stepsister, Jane, who goes by about 4 different aliases. I think it's one for each man she was with. And the latest span was a man named Lord Byron, whom you may have heard of. The original bad boy poet, Lord Byron, creates his own literary trope, the Byronic hero, who is kind of James Dean, the kind of guy, the hero who doesn't fit in, who's brooding, and it's kind of like Achilles, actually. I wonder if he stole that from Achilles. Anyway, doesn't matter. You know the type, right? The Byronic hero. He doesn't fit in, he's misunderstood, and he forges his own way to the disgust of people around him, or sometimes to the interest of certain women around him. So there's, he also traveled with his doctor, Lord Byron did. Again, we'll just leave that there. I don't know what that means. So it's also, it's called The Summer That Never Was. June 1816, the summer that never was, because there was a volcanic eruption in Indonesia and it blocked out the sun. So, in addition to the child death, the suicides, the incest, the polygamy, there was no sun. Okay, and then you've got this gathering. Well, Byron, being Byron, said, we can't go out, let's tell ghost stories. So they all went to bed and they were supposed to come up with a ghost story. Guess who won? Shelley was doing his Shelley thing, which was some long poem. I don't know what Byron did, but nobody came up with anything except the woman. The woman got the job done, and it was Frankenstein. She was reading Paradise Lost at the time. And if you've read this novel, you see Paradise Lost on nearly every page, including literally in the epigram of the novel. Paradise Lost, John Milton, 200 years before, about the fall of Satan, right? So she works on the novel. They return to England. Mary's half-sister Fanny felt excluded from this trip, and so she killed herself. Percy's actual wife, he was married to at the time, Harriet, killed herself. Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley married in December 1817. And Shelley was such a mess that he couldn't even get custody of his own children after his wife had committed suicide. She says of the novel of that night that she had another dream, a kind of daydream. She wasn't asleep. And she says this is what she saw in her daydream. Remember, she's been asked to tell a ghost story. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. And she says she felt the terror for the artist who had endeavored to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world by giving the spark of life to a hideous corpse. Monsters. The subtitle of the novel is The Modern Prometheus. We know that story, remember? We talked about Prometheus, the Titan who is the friend of humanity and gives fire to us. In other stories, he's a culture hero. He gives us everything we need to create culture. And Zeus, of course, is jealous and sends him as punishment a woman named Pandora. And actually goes to his brother Epimetheus, again, weird stuff. And what does Pandora do? She's explicitly told not to open that box. And she opens the box, and the box contains all the evils of the world. There's still hope in the box. It didn't fly out, but yeah, it didn't fly out. So what does that mean? And what's hope doing in a box full of evils? Anyway, that is an excellent question, yes. Hesiod, we know the story from Hesiod. Aeschylus, the playwright, the Greek playwright, had written Prometheus Bound. Percy Bysshe Shelley was writing a long poem called Prometheus Unbound during this time. Prometheus. We're going to hear more about Prometheus. And like I said, this is a hard novel to get at. It's a hard novel to talk about. Where do you start? Do you start chronologically? Well, chronologically is at the beginning, except it's at the end, right? So, and who's the narrator? Is it Walton? Is it Victor? Is it the creature? Well, it's all three. So the novel itself is kind of a monster. It's pieced together with letters, confessions, descriptions, and the structure. Well, let me just show you the structure. Journals, inscriptions, and sometimes they're nested inside of each other, and sometimes they're merely allusions. So look at that. There's the monster's yellow eye at the center. So we begin in the outer ring with Robert Walton's letters back to his sister. He's stuck in the ice. He can't go anywhere. He doesn't have anyone else to write to, apparently, except his sister, who is married. Then we have Victor Frankenstein's narration, telling of his story to Walton in the middle ring. And then on top of the mountain, remember, on top of the Alps, we have just Victor and the creature. And the creature tells his story to Victor. Now, you may recognize this form. It's a frame story. It's actually a double frame story. And it's fairly common. Well, I don't know if it's common, but it's not unusual in 19th century especially British literature. But this is really the first instance of it, all right? Now, Henry James, the American novelist, will pick up on this and do the same thing with his horror story, his ghost story, The Turn of the Screw. Again, you probably are familiar with this. Heart of Darkness, Conrad's Heart of Darkness is the same way, right? You have this threefold structure. But notice what's happening here in terms of intimacy. The most intimacy starts at the center and moves out. So Robert Walton's letters to his sister are not very intimate, and we wouldn't want them to be, right? They're more friendship, and Robert himself is not, he's kind of a dial tone, you know? He's just not really an interesting guy for an explorer. Well, maybe we're comparing him to Victor, I don't know. Victor's narration to Robert Walton is much more vivid, I should say. And then the monster's narration to his creator is impassioned, right? So the intimacy increases as you go in to the center, decreases as you go out. Erudition, speaking well, writing well. Robert Walton's kind of clumsy. I mean, he's not bad, but you can tell he's trying too hard. I think he was the originator of the exclamation mark, right, that I hate, right? Why do we use exclamation marks? Well, Robert Walton started it. So he's all right. Frankenstein, he's a professor of natural philosophy and chemistry. He's much more erudite. Nobody's more erudite than the monster. He knows Paradise Lost. He knows Plutarch. He knows Goethe. Because he hung out in the woods near a family. And he learned everything that Victor should have taught him by watching this family. This family had books and music, so he learned music. And when they were away, he would go in and read their books. Milton, Plutarch. So again, this is not the monster of film, right? This is not the grunting, putting on the Ritz guy in Young Frankenstein, right? He's more erudite. He speaks better than anyone in the novel because he has this education and now he's merged it with this passion. Interesting, right? Immediacy. Robert Walton's letters are years, Robert Walton's letters cover several months, but they are also years after the events. I think it's 2 years after the creation of the monster, right? So there's a distance there. So that space is literally distance in time and space. And of course, as we circle in, it gets more and more immediate. And then mediation. So by that I mean who's speaking of direct experience. That's all I mean by mediation. Well, the monster is obviously speaking of direct experience to Victor in the center. But Robert's telling a story that another guy's telling him about another thing, right? So the mediation increases as you go outward. Victor Frankenstein, let's talk about him. So we talked about creators, and here's another creator, Victor Frankenstein. Mary Shelley was the creator of the novel, Victor Frankenstein, the creator of the creature. Like all gods, Victor is creative. Like Shelley, this god is creating for the first time. So I want you to look at the symmetry between Mary Shelley and Victor Frankenstein. This is her first book. She's 18. Can you believe that? She's 18. This is her first book. And she calls it her hideous creature in the 1831 preface, My Hideous Creature. Victor is like that. Like all creators, Victor is ambivalent about his creation. Read the world's creation myths. It's very rare that you get a creator god saying, oh, let me create this. This is awesome. It's perfect as is. Very rare. The Mayan creation story, Popol Vuh, has 4 different creations of human beings. First creation, the gods make human beings out of mud. It rains and they go, oops, because we melt away in the rain. Then they say, well, let's not make it out of dirt. Let's make this creature out of wood. And so they make them human beings out of wood, and then it rains again, and they float away. I mean, these are the most incompetent creators in the world, right? But it happens over and over again. And even in Genesis, the creation is marred right away. You can say, yes, it was Adam and Eve, but why was that fruit there anyway in a perfect creation? Anyway, let's not get into that. Like Shelley, he is appalled at his creation. Prometheus, we've talked about again. Prometheus is a transgressor. He crosses the line, which is ironic because his name means forethought in Greek. Prometheus, forethought. His brother, Epimetheus, afterthought. So if you were looking for names for your twins, there you go. Prometheus and Epimetheus. Prometheus is about the law of unintended consequences, right? So Prometheus gives fire to human beings, and what do we do with it? We burn things down. I mean, we use it, but we also burn things down. Fire for Prometheus is equal to electricity for Victor Frankenstein. The modern Prometheus is Victor, right? Fire, electricity. Mary Shelley had heard about Benjamin Franklin's experiments on this continent. There was a man named Dr. Galvini who was experimenting with galvanism, that is animating dead flesh through electricity. Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, had made a vermicelli worm move with electricity. There was a lot of talk of electricity at the time. And of course, there's this notion of nurturing creation and abandoning your creation. Prometheus doesn't really abandon his creation, but he is strapped to a rock as punishment, and he can't help humans anymore. All right. He is an alchemist. I mentioned the 2 professors he worked with at Ingolstadt before. 2 extreme positions that Victor kind of drives his way through. There's Professor Krempe, who extols the virtues of science and ridicules the alchemists. We are men of science. We deal with things that can be weighed, counted, and measured. Forget about all that alchemy. Professor Waldman, however, extols the virtues of science, but praises the visions of the alchemists. So he's on board. Victor, taught by both, steers the middle way, as I said, and succeeds. Innocence and experience. Blake had written his Songs of Innocence and Experience before this. There was a sense of knowledge, a renewed sense of the Genesis myth that knowledge produces good and evil, or the knowledge of good and evil, gained through an act of creation and the acquiescence of knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge. And he's a God-monster. We've seen this, right? We know a God-monster. The God-monster duality, the binary is not a binary at all. It's a continuum, and sometimes it's an identity. God-monster, right? That is Victor. He is a liminal creature, and he exists between creature and creator. He is a creature, but he's also a creator. He's a man-god. He speaks, especially in James Whale's work. He loves to portray Victor as a god. That's a whole new world of gods and monsters. Man-woman. Victor gives birth. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And of course, good-evil. Is Victor good? Well, he created life. Victor created a monster. He must be evil. These issues are not resolved. They're still not resolved. All right, so let's look. We've looked at the 2 creators. Let's look at the creatures now. Within the novel, the creature, that's Boris Karloff in the probably most famous image you've seen of Frankenstein. Remember what a monster is. The Latin monstrum means to show, to demonstrate. Same word, to demonstrate. A monster is a sign. What is this monster a sign of? We'll talk about that. It's a monster because Victor says that its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. Now, what's interesting about this monster is that he is not an id. Remember we talked about Freud and the id. The id operates according to the pleasure principle. It wants what it wants. It cares not for the reality principle. It'll take a thumb just as well as a nipple. Doesn't make any difference, just wants. The id as monster is a contemporary invention because our oldest monster is far from the id. He's got an ego and he's got a superego. That's his whole argument against his creator, is what you did to me was wrong, according to ethics. That's a monster talking, right? Not an id. In fact, he's more human than Victor. Read the novel. He's more human than Victor. Because Victor denies and represses what he's done. He flees. He sees his creation come alive and he runs. The monster seeks him. The monster seeks to understand, to know, to understand his place in the world, for his own boundaries, where he should go and not go, what he should do and not do.
What's driving that? Beyond fear, it's more than fear.
On whose part?
On Victor's part. Why is it? If the monster were a beautiful child, there would be a paternal instinct.
That's right.
But this is an ugly creature. An ugly creature yet behaving like a needy child, a child that wants love and affection and
right.
protection.
Right.
So what's going on with Victor on a psychological level or emotional, beyond emotional fear,
right.
that he can't offer some paternal protection, care, or even just interest in this thing that he himself has created?
Yeah, great question. The question is, I'm going to repeat this for the recording because we don't have the audience mics. The question is, what's up with Victor? Why couldn't he just nurture this child that he's created? What's going on in Victor?
What about the notice of his own insecurity?
Exactly. Exactly. Victor's a great scientist, but he's not a great man, right? He is empty. He has been secluded in this Edenic childhood, and like the Buddha, he's never seen evil, right? So now he sees evil, and it's his evil. Yeah, and it drives him. Now, you're right. He doesn't have to make that choice. He could attempt to understand, but he's too weak. Yeah, he's just too weak.
That's what makes him monstrous.
And that makes him monstrous, exactly.
He's also not a god.
Right, right. He has taken on the authority of something that he does not have the moral foundation for. We're going to talk about that. That's our story too, by the way. But exactly, he has the power, but not the morality to handle this situation. And that is us in technology, my friends, right? All right, we'll get to that. Yeah, but there's also this, Sutender, about the gaze, the importance of appearance. It was important for the Romantics, this beauty. Just as there was a kind of worship of beauty, there was a kind of revulsion to ugliness. So that's at work there too. Did you want?
I don't remember whether I said that, but the concept of beauty is what's been going through my mind.
That's right. Well, this is right. That is what the Romantics replaced God with, was beauty. Yeah. So, yeah. He's a tabula rasa. This is John Locke's term from, again, a couple of centuries before, 150 years before. Concerning epistemology, I don't want to go into this too much, but Basically, how do we know what we know? Are we born with certain ideas? Are we born with certain categories? Or are we born with nothing? And then sense data starts to lay itself onto this slate. Well, this was an experiment, a literary experiment in tabula rasa, because Frankenstein is the monster is a tabula rasa. I mentioned he was literate and erudite, the creature. Let me let you hear his voice just so you know. He's talking about hanging out in the woods with the Delancey family and reading their books while he's gone. So this is the monster on Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost excited different and far deeper emotions in me. I read it, as I had read the other volumes, which had fallen into my hands, as a true history. It moved every feeling of wonder and awe that the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures was capable of exciting. I often referred to the several situations as their similarity struck me to my own. Like Adam, I was apparently united by no link to any other being in existence. But Adam's state was far different from mine in every other respect. He had come forth from the hands of a God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the essential care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of a superior nature, but I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition, for often, like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose in me. That's Frankenstein's monster, right? And this word appears so often in the novel Wretched. It's an old word we don't use that often anymore, but there's actually a great literary theorist named Franz Fanon who wrote a really great book called The Wretched of the Earth. Wretched means, it's Old English, it means stranger or exile, one in exile, one who is pursued, a banished person, to drive out, to wretch, the verb is to drive out, to punish. He seeks his creator. He says with Milton, "Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" Or, as your teenager says, "I didn't ask to be born." He seeks companionship. Again, this is him, "Shall each man," cried he, "find a wife for his bosom, each beast have his mate, and I be alone? I had feelings of affection, and they were requited by detestation and scorn. Man, you may hate, but beware, your hours will pass in dread and misery, and soon the bolt will fall, which must ravish you from your happiness forever." He's talking to his Creator. "Are you to be happy while I grovel in the intensity of my wretchedness? You can blast my other passions, but revenge remains. Revenge, henceforth dearer than light or food. I may die, but first you, my tyrant, my tormentor, shall curse the sun that gazes on your misery. Beware, for I am fearless and therefore powerful. I will watch with the wiliness of a snake, that I may sting with its venom. Man, you shall repent of the injuries you inflict." Wow. He has gone from Eden to the fall, right? And so now, in addition to learning companionship from the Delanceys and knowledge from the books, he has now learned hatred and revenge, right? All right, I know we were a little over, so I'm going to go really quickly here. So what's Frankenstein the novel about? What's this story about? Well, it's about creatures and creators, isn't it? This is Victor on the mountain. For the first time also, I felt what the duties of a creator toward his creature were, and that I ought to render him happy before I complained of his wickedness. These motives urged me to comply with his demand, the demand to create a wife. This is about creation without a woman. This is Victor upon seeing his creature. And contrast this to women who see their child for the first time. I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. Rather than this is not Victor, this is me. Rather than clasping this child to his breast, to hold him, to be amazed at him, he rushes out of the room, repulsed by his own creation. When his child follows him, uttering inarticulate sounds of desire and affection and no doubt confusion, like any newborn, smiling at him, reaching out, Frankenstein Victor flees in horror and abandons his child. So, Mary Shelley's in this book. You can count on it. Birth anxiety, right? There was a lot of child death at this time, but Mary had more than her share of it. And she came into the world by killing her mother. That's how she put it, right? Her great mother, the amazing Mary Wollstonecraft, the love of William Godwin's life. Her focus on the birth process illuminates, this is one critic, for a male readership, unpublished female anxieties, fears, and concerns about the birth process and its consequences. At the same time, her story reassures a female audience that such fears are shared by other women. Now think about our monsters that we know in film, and it's not all of them, but some of them are about giving birth, right? Alien and aliens, and those are birth images, birth metaphors. Ripley has birth anxiety. Listen to Victor speaking about his child. I had selected his features as beautiful, beautiful. He had selected his features. Great God, his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing. His teeth of a pearly whiteness. You see, he's almost there. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion, and his straight black lips. This is a novel about the sublime. This is a romantic novel. And so nature is the only healing that Victor gets. That's why he flees to the Alps. That is the only recipe for meaning for the romantic poets, of which Percy Shelley was one, and now his wife, Mary Shelley. The ethical, this is about what we should and should not do, right? Whether if we have the power, does that mean we should do it? In fact, we always do it, don't we? The fall, Genesis. This is the monster again. When I looked around and I saw and heard of none like me, was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? I cannot describe to you the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. This is the monster. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Sorrow only increased with knowledge. Oh, that I had forever remained in my native wood, nor known nor felt beyond the sensations of hunger, thirst, and heat. Of what a strange nature is knowledge. It clings to the mind when it is once seized on it like lichen on a rock. I wish sometimes to shake off all thought and feeling. You ever been there? You might be a monster. But I learned that there was but one means to overcome the sensation of pain, and that was death, a state which I feared, yet I did not understand. Okay, obviously the monster has an existential crisis, as does Victor, and then, of course, technology. Technology is our hopes of fear, as our hopes, but also the creator of our fears. We create things that are beyond our power to understand and control. We do this every chance we get. We do it from the first stick that was used as a club to the atomic bomb, to genetic engineering. We never hesitate, right? Who are we? Are we monsters? Why wouldn't we at least pause? And I know there are voices that say pause and wait, but they are inevitably drowned out, and we proceed anyway. Technology. All right, so I want to end here just very quickly about the myth of Frankenstein itself. The story of Frankenstein, because it has stayed with us from 1818. This story has stayed with us. Why? You can tell when you're around an active myth because it keeps getting told. Now, there are so many stories in the world that you don't know. I mean, there are plenty in our library that you haven't read because those stories aren't active. They were, that's why they're in a library. This story is active. It is lived out every day. It's a story about gods and monsters, which is why we have this course. As I said, it's about creation and its consequences for creatures. I just want to put a lot of alliteration in that one for some reason. Creation and its consequences for creatures. So, again, it's one thing to be a creature and complain to your creator. That's a good Jewish tradition. It's another thing to be the creator, right? And you're all potential creators. You can have children, right? So this is not some guy in Geneva or Ingolstadt. This is all of us. Ask a new parent about that awesome responsibility, that fear. It's about technology and morality. As I said, I won't go over that again. It's about the uncanny, which is something I'm going to talk about more with zombies. But this is a really important concept from Freud that I will talk about with zombies. We're running over. It's about the double nature of humanity. It's about human beings as a god and a monster. And when you try to separate them, beware. Because the person who claims that he is one and not the other is a person you should beware of. Right? It's a person who's trying to signal something about himself and you. And it's usually not good. It's also about the power and the horror, just the horror of the power that we have as human beings. It's bigger than we are. And again, this goes back to religion and the nature of religion as experiencing something bigger, more powerful than yourself, and that producing a feeling of awe and fear. I grew up in the South. I remember the first time I shot a gun. I did that. Except I didn't do it. The technology did it. All right, thank you. Thank you for your patience with the tech stuff. And all right, Frankenstein.
Is it really an autobiography of Mary Shelley? She's the monster, and Victor is her dead mother for abandoning her.
Yeah, well, Nietzsche, we talked about Nietzsche last week. Nietzsche says every piece of writing is autobiography, right? So, yeah, I think so. I mean, it's really, she wrote other novels that were just really bad.
I don't want to shoot holes in it. I haven't read it, and so I don't know.
Yeah.
Much of, like, how does he learn to read? You don't have to answer the questions. These are just, I'm just working these through.
No, I know.
But he's very, he's very self-aware.
Yeah.
He doesn't have the impulse to murder his family. He's not killing,
Not at first.
Okay, and so I'm just trying to piece together how, as a writer, you create something.
Oh. For
Where
your,
I'm going?
no, you're talking about Mary Shelley and how
Yes.
she conceives of this?
Right, and he's erudite, he's well read.
Yeah.
He's mirroring a lot of things that she might
Yeah.
recognize. Right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, this is Mary Shelley's story in many ways. I don't think we should see it as only her story, because as you know, as a writer, there's a story that you have no control of. There's a monster within your writing.
Yeah, and he goes off into all of these wonderful places, the North Pole and all the rest of it. So I just wanted to try and get to that.
Yeah, and like I said, it's hard to talk about this novel. It's hard to write about it because it's pieced together, and you can't. There's like not an entry point, and then you go in here, and you're like, well, I'm not talking about this. And so it comes across that way. It's like, wow, how do we talk about this? There's so much. And that is because it's a myth. I'm convinced this is a myth. This is a big story that we keep telling because it means something to us now. Yeah?